Marcus Thompson stood at the edge of the construction site, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his dirt-covered hand. The London sun was unusually bright for October, and the heat made his work shirt stick to his muscled back. 28 years old, Marcus had built his reputation as one of the toughest foremen in South London. His crew respected him not just because he could outwork any of them, but because he had never backed down from a fight in his entire life. Other workers gathered around the lunch truck, but Marcus remained standing, watching the busy street beyond the construction fence. His sister Emma had been texting him all morning about visiting some tourist spots together. She worked as a teacher at a local primary school and always tried to get Marcus to do normal things that regular people enjoyed. Museums, galleries, sightseeing tours. Marcus usually found excuses to avoid these activities because they seemed boring and pointless to him. Today was different, though. Emma had mentioned Buckingham Palace and something about watching the guards. Marcus had seen pictures of these guards in their red uniforms and tall black hats, standing perfectly still like toys. The idea amused him. He wondered what kind of men would choose to stand around all day doing nothing, pretending to be important. While tourists took pictures of them, his phone buzzed again. Emma was persistent when she wanted something. Marcus looked at the message and sighed. She really wanted him to meet her at the palace gates at 2 o'clock. His workday was almost finished anyway, and he had nothing else planned for the afternoon. Maybe it would be entertaining to see these famous guards that everyone talked about. Marcus called out to his crew that he was leaving early. The men nodded and waved, used to their boss finishing work whenever he felt like it. Being good at his job had its advantages. He owned his own small construction company, and clients trusted him to get things done properly and on time. This gave him freedom that most workers never enjoyed. He walked to his old Ford truck, brushing concrete dust from his jeans. The truck had seen better days, but it was reliable and suited his practical nature. Marcus had never cared much about appearances or impressing people with expensive things. His strength and reputation were all the status he needed. The drive through London traffic gave Marcus time to think about his sister. Emma was 5 years younger and completely different from him. Where he was loud and confrontational, she was quiet and thoughtful. Where he solved problems with his fists, she used words and patience. Despite their differences, they had remained close since their parents died in a car accident 10 years earlier. Emma was the only person whose opinion Marcus truly cared about as he parked near the palace. Marcus could already see crowds of tourists walking around with cameras and guidebooks. Families with children, elderly couples, groups of friends from different countries. They all seemed excited about seeing the palace and its guards. Marcus found their enthusiasm amusing. These people had traveled from all over the world to look at some buildings and watch men in costumes stand still. Emma was waiting by the main gates. Wearing her usual neat clothes and carrying a small backpack, she smiled when she saw him approaching, clearly pleased that he had actually shown up. Emma had learned not to expect too much from her brother when it came to social activities, so his presence was a genuine surprise. They joined the crowd gathering for the changing of the guard ceremony. Marcus looked around at the other visitors, noting how different they were from the people he usually spent time with. Construction workers, pub regulars, football fans. These tourists seemed soft and pampered to him, holding expensive phones and wearing clean clothes that had never seen a day of real work. The palace itself was impressive, Marcus had to admit. The golden gates, the perfectly maintained grounds, the sense of history and importance. But what caught his attention were the guards themselves. Several men in bright red uniforms stood at various positions around the palace entrance. Their tall black hats made them look taller than they probably were, and their rifles were held in identical positions. One guard in particular drew Marcus's focus. This man stood closest to where the crowd had gathered, maybe 20 feet away, from the barriers that kept tourists at a safe distance. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of build that suggested real physical strength, but he stood completely motionless, staring straight ahead as if the crowd of people did not exist. Marcus studied the guard's face, looking for any sign of emotion or awareness. The man's expression was blank, professional, giving away nothing about his thoughts or feelings. His eyes seemed to look through the crowd rather than at them. This perfect stillness began to irritate Marcus in a way he could not fully explain. Emma was talking about the history of the guards and their role in protecting the royal family. But Marcus was not really listening. He was focused on the motionless soldier, wondering what kind of person could stand so still for so long. Was this man really tough? Or was he just playing a role for the tourists? Marcus had dealt with plenty of men who looked impressive, but folded quickly when challenged. The crowd grew larger as more tourists arrived for the ceremony. People pushed closer to get better views and photos. Marcus found himself studying not just the guard, but the reactions of the people around him. They seemed genuinely impressed by these soldiers, treating them like they were special or important. This attitude puzzled Marcus. In his world, respect was earned through action, not through wearing a fancy uniform and standing still. Real toughness was proven in actual confrontations, not in ceremonial displays. He began to wonder if these guards were really as disciplined and skilled as everyone seemed to believe, or if they were just ordinary men playing dress-up for the entertainment of tourists. The thought planted itself in Marcus's mind and began to grow stronger as he watched the unmoving soldier. Here was a man who looked strong and capable, but who had never proven himself in any real way that Marcus could. See? The guard's perfect posture and blank expression started to seem less impressive, more like a challenge that needed to be answered. Marcus continued to stare at the guard, while Emma pointed out different parts of the palace to him. She was explaining something about the architecture and the royal family's history, but her words faded into background noise. All of Marcus's attention was focused on the soldier, who stood like a statue near the palace gates. The guard had not moved even slightly in the 15 minutes since Marcus had been watching him. Not a twitch, not a blink that Marcus could see, not even a shift in weight from one foot to the other. The man's rifle remained in exactly the same position, held at a perfect angle across his chest. His chin stayed level, his shoulders square, his eyes fixed on some invisible point in the distance. This level of stillness bothered Marcus more than he expected. In his world, men who stood around doing nothing were usually lazy or weak. Real workers moved constantly, lifting, carrying, building, fixing things. Even when construction workers took breaks, they talked and joked and showed signs of life. This guard seemed more like a machine than a person. Emma noticed that her brother was not paying attention to her tour guide commentary. She followed his gaze and saw him staring intently at the nearest guard. She knew that look on Marcus's face. It was the same expression he got right before he did something stupid and reckless. The crowd around them had grown to nearly 100 people, all waiting for the official ceremony to begin. Tourists from different countries chatted in various languages. Children pointed excitedly at the colorful uniforms, and cameras flashed constantly. The atmosphere was festive and peaceful, exactly the kind of environment where Marcus usually felt out of place. A family from America stood nearby, and Marcus could hear the father explaining to his young son about the importance of the Queen's guard. The man spoke with obvious respect and admiration for these soldiers, describing them as elite troops chosen for their discipline and skill. The boy listened with wide eyes, clearly impressed by the idea of these special warriors protecting the royal family. This conversation irritated Marcus even more. Elite troops, special warriors. The words seemed ridiculous when applied to men, whose job was to stand still and look impressive for tourists. Marcus had served briefly in the Army Reserves years earlier, but he had quit because he found the discipline and routine boring. Real fighting happened in pubs and construction sites, not in parade formations. He began to study the guards' equipment more closely. The rifle looked real enough, though Marcus doubted it was loaded. The red uniform was obviously expensive and well-maintained, with shiny buttons and perfect creases. The tall black hat added an extra foot to the man's height, making him appear more imposing than he probably was underneath all the ceremony. But what struck Marcus most was the guard's age. The man looked to be in his 30s, around Marcus's own age, with the kind of weathered face that suggested real experience. This was not some young recruit playing soldier. This was a grown man who had chosen to spend his time standing perfectly still, while tourists took pictures of him. Marcus whispered to Emma about how ridiculous the whole thing seemed. She shushed him and tried to move them further back in the crowd, but Marcus resisted. He wanted to stay close enough to keep studying the guard, looking for any sign of weakness or humanity behind the professional mask. The ceremony was supposed to begin in 10 minutes, according to Emma's guidebook. Marcus wondered what would happen if someone tried to distract or provoke one of these guards before then. Were they allowed to respond, or did they have to maintain their statue-like pose no matter what happened around them? He had heard stories about tourists trying to make the guards laugh or react, usually without success. Videos online showed people dancing, making faces, or telling jokes right in front of the soldiers, who remained completely unresponsive. This superhuman level of self-control seemed unnatural to Marcus, who had never hidden his emotions or reactions from anyone. A group of teenagers nearby were taking selfies with the guard in the background, trying different poses and expressions. They giggled and whispered about how handsome the soldier was, how professional he looked, how they wished they could talk to him. Their obvious attraction to the man in uniform annoyed Marcus for reasons he could not fully identify. Emma grabbed his arm and suggested they move to a better viewing position for the ceremony. But Marcus shook his head and stayed where he was. He had become genuinely curious about this particular guard and wanted to see what would happen if someone actually challenged the man's impressive self-control. The American father was now taking pictures of his family with the guard visible behind them. He thanked the soldier politely, even though the man could not acknowledge him, and explained to his wife how much training and dedication were required to serve in this position. His respectful attitude towards someone who was essentially a living decoration struck Marcus as foolish and unnecessary. Marcus began to speak more loudly, making comments about the guards that other tourists could hear. He questioned whether these men were really as tough as they appeared, or if they were just actors putting on a show. Some people in the crowd looked uncomfortable with his tone, but others seemed curious about what he might do next. Emma tried again to pull him away, but Marcus was committed now to testing this guard's famous discipline. He stepped closer to the barrier that separated tourists from the palace grounds, positioning himself where the soldier could not help but see and hear him clearly. The guard gave no sign that he noticed Marcus's approach or heard his increasingly loud commentary. His expression remained completely neutral, his posture unchanged, his breathing steady and controlled. But something in the man's eyes suggested that he was very much aware of everything happening around him, including the growing attention from one particular tourist who seemed determined to cause trouble. Marcus felt a familiar excitement building in his chest. It was the same feeling he got before every fight, every confrontation, every moment when he proved his dominance over someone who had challenged or disrespected him. This guard represented everything that irritated Marcus about people who thought they were better than him simply because they wore uniforms or held positions of authority. The stage was set for a confrontation that would change everything for both men, though neither of them fully understood what was about to happen. Marcus had reached the point where talking was no longer enough. The guard's complete lack of response to his verbal challenges felt like the ultimate insult. In every other confrontation of his life, Marcus had at least gotten some kind of reaction. Fear, anger, preparation for a fight, something that showed his opponent was taking him seriously. This soldier's perfect stillness seemed to mock everything Marcus believed about strength and respect. The crowd around them had grown tense and expectant. People could sense that something significant was about to happen, even if they were not sure exactly what. Some tourists continued to record with their phones, while others looked around nervously for security or police officers who might intervene before things got out of hand. Emma made one final desperate attempt to stop her brother. She grabbed his arm firmly and spoke directly into his ear, telling him that he was about to make a terrible mistake. She reminded him that these guards were real soldiers, not just ceremonial figures. She warned him that attacking a member of the Queen's Guard would have serious legal consequences that could ruin his life. But Marcus was beyond listening to reason. The adrenaline was pumping through his system now, and his mind was focused entirely on the challenge in front of him. He had never backed down from a fight in his entire adult life, and he was not about to start now, especially not in front of all these people who were watching and recording. He looked directly at Sergeant Hayes and spoke loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. He told the guard that he was about to find out what a real punch felt like. He announced that all the fancy uniform and ceremony in the world would not help when faced with genuine strength and fighting experience. His voice carried the absolute confidence of someone who had never lost a physical confrontation. Hayes heard every word but continued to maintain his position. However, his body was now fully prepared for combat. Years of military training had taught him to stay calm under pressure, while simultaneously preparing for immediate action. He could see the aggression in the tourist's posture and knew that violence was now inevitable. Marcus stepped back slightly and rolled his shoulders, loosening up his muscles the way he always did before a fight. This was a ritual he had performed dozens of times in pubs and construction sites across London. Familiar preparation helped him focus his mind and energy on the task ahead. He flexed his hands into fists, feeling the calluses and scars that marked years of physical work and fighting. The remaining tourists formed a rough circle around Marcus and the guard, though they maintained a safe distance from what was obviously about to become a violent confrontation. Many of them held their phones ready to capture whatever happened next. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation and nervous energy. Emma backed away from her brother, tears of frustration and fear in her eyes. She knew that nothing she could say or do would stop him now. Marcus had entered the mental state that always preceded his fights, where he became completely focused on proving his dominance over whoever had challenged him. She could only hope that the consequences would not be as severe as she feared. Hayes remained in his ceremonial position, rifle held at the proper angle, eyes focused straight ahead. But every sense was now alert and ready. He had assessed his opponent during the long minutes of verbal provocation and had formed a clear picture of what he was dealing with. This was an experienced street fighter who relied on aggression and physical strength, but who had probably never faced anyone with professional combat training. Marcus took a deep breath and centered himself, the way he always did before throwing the first punch. This was the moment he lived for, when all the talking ended and physical reality took over. He had built his entire adult identity around his ability to win these confrontations, and he was absolutely certain that this guard would be no different from all his previous opponents. The construction worker drew back his right fist, putting his full body weight behind what he intended to be a devastating blow. This was the same punch that had ended fights in pubs across South London, the punch that had earned him respect and fear from men who thought they were tough. He aimed directly at the center of the guard's chest, where the red uniform displayed all its ceremonial medals and decorations. Time seemed to slow down as Marcus committed fully to his attack. The crowd held its breath, cameras focused on the moment of impact. Emma closed her eyes in horror. This was the point of no return, the instant when verbal confrontation became physical violence with all its unpredictable consequences. Hayes saw the punch coming from the moment Marcus began to draw back his arm. The attack was telegraphed clearly. With none of the subtlety or speed that marked professional fighting, the guard had faced trained enemies in actual combat situations where his life was at stake. This angry tourist, despite his obvious physical strength, was moving in slow motion compared to real threats Hayes had countered. Marcus's fist connected with Hayes's chest with a solid thud that echoed across the courtyard. The punch landed exactly where Marcus had aimed it, delivering what should have been enough force to stagger any normal man. Marcus felt the impact travel up his arm and smiled with satisfaction, certain that he had just proven his point about the difference between real strength and ceremonial pretense. But Sergeant Hayes did not move. Not an inch, not a fraction of an inch. The punch that Marcus was so proud of, the same blow that had won him countless fights, had absolutely no visible effect on the trained soldier. Hayes absorbed the impact as if it were nothing more than a gentle tap, his expression unchanged, his posture perfect, his breathing steady. For a split second, the entire scene was frozen in disbelief. Marcus stared at his fist, still pressed against the guard's chest, unable to comprehend what had just happened. The crowd was silent, shocked by the complete lack of reaction from the soldier. Emma opened her eyes to see her brother standing motionless, his confident expression replaced by confusion and growing fear. Hayes had felt the punch, of course, but years of physical conditioning and combat experience had prepared his body to absorb much more significant impacts without losing control. The tourist's attack, while strong by civilian standards, was nothing compared to what he had endured during military training and actual warfare. Now, it was Hayes's turn to respond. And Marcus was about to learn the difference between street fighting and professional combat training. Marcus moved even closer to the barrier, his voice growing louder with each comment he made about the motionless guard. Other tourists began to notice the change in atmosphere as this rough-looking man in work clothes started to dominate the peaceful scene with his increasingly aggressive observations. The guard he was focused on was Sergeant William Hayes. Though Marcus had no way of knowing the man's name or background, Hayes had been serving with the Queen's Guard for 8 years, following 2 tours of duty in Afghanistan where he had seen real combat and learned what actual danger looked like. Standing perfectly still while tourists watched was easy compared to the life-or-death situations he had survived overseas. Hayes could hear every word that Marcus was saying, even though he gave no outward sign of listening. His training had taught him to remain aware of everything happening around him while maintaining complete physical discipline. He had dealt with difficult tourists before, people who tried to provoke reactions or test his professional control. Most of them were harmless attention seekers who gave up quickly when they realized he would not respond. But something about this particular man felt different. Hayes could sense genuine aggression rather than playful mischief.
The tourists'
body language suggested someone who was used to physical confrontation and might actually be preparing for violence. Hayes remained motionless, but his mind began to assess the potential threat and consider his options. Marcus was now speaking loud enough that most of the crowd could hear him clearly. He questioned whether these guards were really soldiers or just dress-up actors hired to entertain tourists. He wondered out loud if they would know how to fight if someone actually challenged them. His comments were designed to provoke not just the guard, but also the other visitors who seemed so impressed by the ceremony. Emma felt her face burning with embarrassment as people began to stare at her brother. She could see phones being pulled out to record what was obviously building towards some kind of confrontation. She tried once more to convince Marcus to leave, tugging at his sleeve and whispering urgently that he was making a scene. But Marcus brushed her off, completely focused on the guard, who continued to ignore his presence. A middle-aged British woman nearby told Marcus that he should show more respect for the Queen's Guard. She explained that these men were genuine soldiers who had earned their positions through dedication and service. Her tone was polite but firm, clearly disapproving of his behavior towards someone who could not defend himself verbally. This intervention only made Marcus more determined to prove his point. He asked the woman what was so special about standing still and looking pretty for cameras. Real men, he declared, prove themselves through action, not through playing statue for tourists. His voice carried the confidence of someone who had never lost a physical fight and believed that this gave him the right to challenge anyone he chose. The crowd was now clearly divided between those who were uncomfortable with Marcus's behavior and those who were curious to see what would happen next. Some people moved away, not wanting to be involved in whatever was developing. Others stayed close, sensing that they might witness something dramatic that they could share with friends. Later, Hayes continued to maintain his position, but he was now fully focused on the aggressive tourist. Through years of experience, he had learned to read people quickly and accurately. This man was not going to be satisfied with just making noise. He was building up to something more serious, and Hayes needed to be ready to respond appropriately. When that moment came, Marcus began to describe his own fighting experience to anyone who would listen. He talked about pub brawls he had won, workplace disputes he had settled with his fists, and his general reputation as someone who never backed down from a challenge. He spoke as if these experiences made him somehow superior to a man whose job was to stand guard in a ceremonial position. The American family that had been taking pictures earlier moved further away, the father clearly not wanting his young son to witness whatever was about to happen. Other tourists began to follow their example, creating more space around Marcus and the guard. This only encouraged Marcus, who interpreted their departure as evidence that people recognized he was about to prove something important. Emma realized that her brother was beyond reasoning with. She had seen him in this state before, usually right before he did something that got him into serious trouble. But this situation was different from his usual pub fights or construction site disputes. This was happening in public, in front of hundreds of people, with cameras recording everything. The consequences of whatever he was planning could be much more serious than he realized. Hayes noticed the crowd thinning around the aggressive tourist, which told him that other people also sensed escalation coming. He began to prepare mentally for the possibility that he might need to defend himself while still maintaining his official duties. His training had covered these scenarios. Though they were rare in practice, Marcus stepped as close to the barrier as possible, positioning himself directly in front of the guard. He was now less than 10 feet away from Hayes, close enough to see the man's face clearly. Still, the soldier gave no indication that he was aware of Marcus's presence or concerned about his increasingly threatening behavior. This complete lack of response drove Marcus to new levels of frustration. In every other confrontation of his life, his opponents had at least acknowledged him, shown some sign of fear or preparation for conflict. This guard's absolute stillness seemed like the ultimate form of disrespect. As if Marcus was not even worth noticing, the ceremony was supposed to begin in just a few minutes. But Marcus had lost all interest in watching some formal parade. His entire focus was now on this one man who refused to acknowledge his existence. He began to make more direct challenges, questioning the guard's courage and ability to handle himself in a real fight. Hayes could feel the situation reaching a critical point. His years of experience told him that this tourist was about to cross the line from verbal provocation to physical action. He remained perfectly still, but every muscle in his body was now prepared to respond instantly to whatever came next. Marcus looked around at the remaining crowd, most of whom were now watching him rather than preparing for the ceremony. He felt the familiar rush of adrenaline that came before every fight, the excitement of proving himself against someone who thought they were better than him. This guard was about to learn what happened to people who disrespected Marcus Thompson. The moment of shocked silence stretched on as Marcus stood frozen with his fists still pressed against the guard's chest. His mind struggled to process what had just happened. The punch that had never failed him before, the blow that had ended every fight he had ever been in, had done absolutely nothing to this man in the red uniform. Sergeant Hayes remained perfectly still for exactly 3 seconds after the impact. During those seconds, he made a professional assessment of the situation. The tourist had just committed assault against a member of the Queen's Guard in full view of dozens of witnesses. Hayes now had both the legal right and the professional duty to respond with appropriate force to neutralize the threat. Hayes had been trained in multiple forms of combat. During his military career, he knew exactly how much force was needed to stop an aggressor without causing permanent damage. He understood the difference between defending himself and taking revenge. What he was about to do would be measured, precise, and completely professional. Marcus finally stepped back from the guard, his face showing confusion and growing panic. For the first time in his adult life, he had thrown his best punch and achieved nothing. The guard looked exactly the same as before the attack. Same posture, same expression, same steady breathing. It was as if Marcus had punched a wall instead of a human being. The crowd around them had grown completely silent. Even the children had stopped talking, sensing that something unprecedented was happening. Cameras continued to record, but the people holding them seemed stunned by what they were witnessing. This was not going the way anyone had expected. Emma watched her brother's face change from confidence to confusion to fear. She had never seen Marcus look uncertain in a physical confrontation. Throughout their entire lives, he had been the one who solved problems with strength and aggression. Now he looked like a child who had just discovered that his favorite toy was broken. Hayes moved without any warning or a change in his ceremonial stance. His left hand remained perfectly positioned on his rifle, maintaining his official posture even as his right hand struck out with lightning speed and surgical precision. The punch was a textbook example of military combat training, delivered with exactly the right amount of force to achieve its purpose. The blow connected with Marcus's solar plexus, the soft spot just below the rib cage where a precise strike could temporarily paralyze the diaphragm muscle. Hayes had calculated the impact carefully, using just enough force to incapacitate his attacker without causing serious injury. It was the kind of strike that ended fights quickly and cleanly. Marcus doubled over instantly, his body folding in half as all the air rushed out of his lungs. The pain was unlike anything he had ever experienced, sharp and overwhelming, but it was the inability to breathe that truly terrified him. His diaphragm had been shocked into temporary paralysis, leaving him gasping helplessly like a fish pulled. From water, he fell to his knees on the pavement, clutching his stomach and making desperate choking sounds as he tried to force air into his lungs. His face turned red, then purple, as panic set in. For a moment, Marcus thought he might actually die right there in front of Buckingham Palace. Killed by a single punch from a man who had barely seemed to move, Hayes immediately returned to his ceremonial position as if nothing had happened. His rifle was back in its proper place, his posture perfect, his expression neutral. The only evidence that he had just delivered a devastating counterattack was the man writhing on the ground in front of him. To any casual observer, it would have seemed impossible that this motionless guard had just incapacitated a much larger opponent. The crowd erupted in shocked murmurs and gasps. People who had been recording the confrontation now found themselves with footage of something far more dramatic than they had expected. The arrogant tourist who had been threatening the guard was now helpless on the ground, completely defeated by a single, barely visible strike. Emma rushed to her brother's side, kneeling beside him as he struggled to breathe. She had no medical training, but she tried to help him calm down and focus on getting air back into his lungs. She whispered reassurances that he would be okay, that the paralysis was temporary, that he just needed to stay calm and let his body recover. Other tourists began to back away, many of them looking guilty about their earlier enjoyment of the confrontation. What had seemed like entertainment when Marcus was making threats now looked cruel and uncomfortable with him defeated and gasping on the pavement. Some people put away their phones, suddenly uncomfortable with recording someone's humiliation. Marcus slowly began to get small amounts of air back into his lungs. The paralysis was wearing off, but the pain in his chest remained intense. More than the physical discomfort, though, was the psychological shock of what had just happened. He had been defeated so completely and easily that he could barely comprehend it. As his breathing gradually returned to normal, Marcus became aware of the crowd watching him. Dozens of people had witnessed his humiliation. Many of them had recorded it on their phones. The man who had built his entire identity around never losing a fight had just been destroyed by someone who had barely moved. Hayes continued his duty as if nothing had occurred. His training had taught him to compartmentalize incidents like this, to deal with threats efficiently, and then return immediately to his assigned role. He showed no emotion, no satisfaction, no acknowledgement that anything unusual had happened. Security personnel began to arrive. Having been alerted by other guards who had witnessed the incident, they approached Marcus cautiously, ready to arrest him for assault, but they could see that he was no longer a threat to anyone. The man who had seemed so dangerous a few minutes earlier was now sitting on the ground. Holding his chest and looking completely defeated, Emma helped Marcus get back to his feet, though he remained hunched over and moved slowly. His legs felt weak and unsteady. Whether from the physical impact or the psychological shock, he could not tell.
Ow.
All he knew was that everything he had believed about himself had just been proven wrong in the most public and humiliating way possible. Construction worker who had never lost a fight had just learned that there were levels of skill and training far beyond anything he had ever encountered. His world had changed forever in the space of a single, devastating punch. The security officers approached Marcus carefully, but they could see immediately that he posed no further threat. The man who had been so aggressive and confident just minutes earlier was now sitting on the pavement, still struggling with his breathing and looking completely broken. One of the officers radioed for medical assistance. Though it was clear that Marcus was not seriously injured, just shocked and humiliated, Emma knelt beside her brother, torn between concern for his physical condition and embarrassment at his behavior. She had warned him that this would end badly, But even she had not imagined how quickly and completely he would be defeated. The guard had made it look effortless, as if dealing with aggressive tourists was just another routine part of his job. The crowd that had gathered to watch the confrontation began to disperse slowly. Many people were reviewing the videos they had recorded on their phones, still trying to process what they had witnessed. The incident had lasted less than 5 minutes from start to finish, but it had been more dramatic than anything most of them had ever seen in person. A few tourists approached the security officers too, offered their testimony about what had happened. They all confirmed the same basic facts. The man in work clothes had been making threats and challenging the guard for several minutes before throwing the first punch. The guard had remained completely professional throughout the incident and had only responded with force after being physically attacked. Marcus slowly got back to his feet with Emma's help, though he still moved carefully and kept one hand pressed to his chest. The pain was beginning to fade, but the humiliation burned much deeper. He looked around at the faces watching him and saw everything from sympathy to amusement to disapproval. None of them looked at him with the respect he had always commanded through his reputation for toughness. Sergeant Hayes continued to stand at his post as if nothing had happened. He had returned to his ceremonial duties immediately after neutralizing the threat, showing no emotion or acknowledgement of what had just occurred. To anyone who had not witnessed the confrontation, he would have appeared to be just another guard performing his routine duties. The security officers questioned Marcus about the incident, though their tone was more professional than hostile. They explained that he had committed assault against a member of the Queen's Guard, and that charges could be filed against him. However, they also noted that he had been clearly outmatched and humiliated, which might be considered sufficient consequence for his actions. Emma spoke quietly with the officers, explaining that her brother was not normally violent toward strangers, and that he had clearly learned his lesson. She apologized repeatedly for his behavior and promised that nothing like this would ever happen again. Her genuine distress and embarrassment seemed to influence their decision about how to handle the situation. Marcus found himself unable to speak coherently about what had happened. When the officers asked him why he had attacked the guard, he could only mumble something about wanting to test the man's toughness. The explanation sounded ridiculous even to him now, especially while standing there defeated and humiliated in front of dozens of witnesses. One of the security officers took Marcus aside and spoke to him directly about the reality of what he had just experienced. He explained that the Queen's Guard were not ceremonial figures but genuine soldiers with extensive combat training. Many of them had served in active combat zones and had skills far beyond anything a civilian street fighter could match. This conversation was the beginning of Marcus's education about the difference between being tough and being trained. The officer described the years of physical conditioning, martial arts training, and real-world combat experience that soldiers like Sergeant Hayes possessed. He helped Marcus understand that his construction site fighting experience was essentially worthless against someone with professional military skills. Within an hour of the incident, videos of Marcus's humiliation were already appearing on social media. People who had witnessed the confrontation had uploaded their recordings with titles like "Tourist Gets Reality Check from Queen's Guard" and "When Bullying Goes Wrong." The footage spread quickly across multiple platforms, viewed by thousands of people within the first few hours. Emma was horrified when she discovered that the incident was going viral online. She tried to convince her brother to stay off social media for a while, but Marcus had already seen some of the videos and comments. People were mocking his defeat, questioning his masculinity, and using his humiliation as entertainment. Respect he had built over years of winning fights was being destroyed in a matter of hours. The construction crew that Marcus supervised learned about the incident through social media before he even returned to work. When he finally showed up at the job site the next day, his workers greeted him with a mixture of sympathy and barely concealed amusement. The man who had built his authority on physical dominance now found himself the subject of jokes and whispered conversations. Over the following weeks, Marcus struggled to come to terms with what had happened to him. The physical pain from the UHA, the physical pain from the UHHL, the forward is into someone else's arms. conversations. Is it over the following weeks? Over the following weeks? Marcus struggled to come to terms. Well, the pair. The second to how? The fucking way. The fucking way. Guard's punch had faded within a day, but the psychological impact lingered much longer. He found himself questioning everything he had believed about strength, toughness, and what it meant to be a man. Emma tried to help her brother process the experience, suggesting that perhaps it was an opportunity for him to grow and change. She pointed out that he had been relying on intimidation and violence to solve problems for years, and that this defeat might teach him to find better ways of dealing with conflict. Gradually, Marcus began to understand that real strength was not about winning fights or intimidating people. The guard who had defeated him so easily had shown more discipline and control in those few minutes than Marcus had demonstrated in his entire adult life. Hayes had remained calm under pressure, used exactly the right amount of force to resolve the situation, and then immediately returned to his duties without gloating or showing off. This realization marked the beginning of a fundamental change in how Marcus viewed himself and the world around him. The man who had challenged a royal guard with a swing had learned that true strength comes from training, discipline, and the wisdom to know when and how to use force appropriately. Was it a lesson that would stay with him for the rest of his life, even though it had come at the cost of his pride and reputation?